Because a lot of people have maybe not announced that they are closing their restaurants for good, but in essence, that's what they've done.
Until last month, Zach Geballe worked at a Seattle restaurant and watched as the first cases of coronavirus changed his hometown weeks before the rest of the country.
I lost my job. I lost my primary source of income, and unemployment's not going to make up for that at this point. I kept trying to shake people I knew in the industry awake. Like, this is not, yeah, we might have to buy some gloves and have people wear them. This is you are not going to be able to be open soon.
He'll tell us about the economic and social toll of the virus on the American city that's been dealing with it the longest.
When I do go to the grocery store on occasion, or walk my dog, or take my son out, there's that like shrug emoji feeling,
Yeah.
and also the kind of like, can we still talk to one another?
Hello from Queens, where we've also perfected the shrug emoji. I'm Brooke Silva Braga. This is Ahead of the Curve, where we have conversations with people from the places that have been dealing with coronavirus the longest, and we delay those chats by the same amount of time they are ahead of the US. It hopefully creates some interesting comparisons. In the last couple weeks, we've spoken to folks from Italy and South Korea. In the next couple weeks, Taiwan and China. But today's something a little different. We're going to have this conversation with a man from Seattle, Washington. Seattle was really the first city that had to deal with coronavirus. And so we're going to talk to Zach Geballe about kind of how they've watched the rest of the country be a little bit behind Seattle, what the experience there has been like over the last couple months. I thought Washington and Seattle would be interesting to do because you guys are almost like your own country. Yeah. That was like ahead of the rest of this country. And the perspective you have that folks in other countries don't have is you're still here in the US consuming American media, having an American experience.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how you felt the country being behind where you guys are.
So, I mean, I think for me, being someone who was working in and around restaurants in particular, one of the striking things to me was seeing, the shift happened in Seattle in, I would say, really noticeably the very beginning of March. So just for a timeline's sake, the first fatality in the U.S., which happened in Kirkland, which is just across Lake Washington from Seattle, was February 29th, which was a Saturday. And I was working in the restaurant that night. And that news came across, and whatever. We had been talking about it because obviously those first cases were in the area, and it was sort of in the news locally, and obviously nationally too. But and it was really noticeable. So that Saturday night was pretty normal in the restaurant. The next day was dramatically slower. And I was talking to, I was seeing it on forums for people in the industry. Do we need to start paying attention to sanitation? And, do we have to start being a little more forward thinking about that? And I was trying to tell them, like, honestly, you have to start thinking about if your restaurant's going to be open in 2 weeks, because you could just see what was happening in Seattle. Places were starting to close. The restaurant company I work for closed all of its restaurants. It announced it on Wednesday, March 11th, that they would all be closing on Sunday the 15th, which ended up being the day that Governor Inslee passed or sort of issued the stay-at-home order anyhow. So even if we hadn't made that announcement, we would have been closed within the day or two anyhow. And it was really like, I kept trying to shake people I knew in the industry awake. Like, this is not, yeah, we might have to buy some gloves and have people wear them. This is you are not going to be able to be open soon. And hard to know in each place when that would happen, but it was clear that that's what was coming.
Yeah, and you guys have had to deal with it being closed longer than these other places. Mm-hmm. Have you noticed, as the time has worn on, a change? I guess, are people giving up? Do they assume they'll reopen? Is that any different than it was a couple weeks ago?
Everyone's in sort of dry dock, right? If and when the ability to reopen restaurants happens, it's going to happen in a really sort of staggered and piecemeal fashion, because a lot of people have maybe not announced that they are closing their restaurants for good, but in essence, that's what they've done. And if they reopen, it's going to have to be with a lot of funding that's probably going to have to come from some other entity, whether that's outside investment or the government or something.
Well, wait, explain that. You closed down. Why can't I just reopen 2 months later?
Well, I think part of it is, the restaurant industry in particular is dependent on a lot of very perishable items, right? So if you have tens of thousands of dollars of food product that you're hoping to sell, when you close down, you either sold that off, gave it away, donated it, but you may not have 20 or 30,000 or $40,000 to buy all the product you need on hand to operate a reasonable sized restaurant for even just a week. That's even assuming that, you can hire staff back because, a lot of people have been laid off. And the other big unknown in this is, how is the public going to respond? I think there's some belief, and maybe it's founded, that some people will be very eager to go back out and dine because they're sick of being in their house. And I certainly think all of us feel that to some extent. I tend to think that a lot of people are going to be very cautious for, months past whenever, people are kind of permitted to leave the house. And I think restaurants are going to be one of those things that a lot of people say, well, do I really want that? Maybe I really want to be able to go out to the park. I want to be able to get my kids somewhere. I want to be able to do, but I'm not going to go to a movie theater or a restaurant because, like, do I really need that? I might get more takeout, but I'm not necessarily going to put myself at risk, perceived risk at least, in that way. And that's something that restaurants are going to have to grapple with and are thinking about, but may not have answers to yet.
Yeah. The other way that you guys are ahead is you're dealing with this before the rest of the country, but the national stimulus bill, those checks are going to go out to Washington the same day they go out to Arizona. And so people there are having to deal with all the economic impacts longer than anyone else. And so kind of, again, like canary in the coal mine, I'm wondering, like, have you noticed anything in the last couple weeks where things seem to be getting more desperate? Either you hear it in the local news, friends.
I think the state has so far done a relatively good job of getting unemployment checks to those people where rent was an issue. I know there have been a lot of efforts made to kind of mitigate that. Totally candidly, like we renegotiated our rent. My wife and I rent a house, and we renegotiated our rent with our the landlord and the property management company, and they were we were able to find a number that worked for everyone for the time being. And I'm thankful that they saw, they recognized that, I lost my job, I lost my primary source of income, and unemployment's not going to make up for that at this point. And so I think that part has been good. I know there have been a lot of efforts to provide, we're members of a synagogue, and there have been a lot of emails about things you can do to support synagogue members and other community members generally who are, struggling. There's been a lot of communication. I think the hard part for a lot of us, and this is not a Seattle specific issue, is a lot of the things we would want to do for people in these circumstances, like provide meals, provide job training opportunities, just are not possible in this crisis, both because there are, jobs are not something that are readily available outside of a few sectors. And also just, we have to stay apart. And so the things you would do to kind of provide comfort and literal sustenance to friends and family who had lost their jobs, we just can't do. And that part's been hard, but that's been a problem everywhere. It's not just a Seattle thing.
I'm curious, to the extent you're willing to go into it, like how a rent renegotiation works. Do you have a new rate, or they offer it for a couple months? What are they willing to give you?
We basically agreed to a reduction. I won't go into the exact details, but basically, that we saw a reduction in our rent for April and May to this point. With the idea that we'll reconsider it. That was sort of commensurate to essentially my reduction in income. So, we were really honest with them. Like, hey, this is how much my income has gone down. Here's what we think that means to what we can pay in rent. Fortunately, they were like, that sounds fair to us. Basically, we'll revisit this come, June. We're happy to basically resume paying the rent we were paying. It's just, we had to kind of, I was very proactive with like, hey, I've lost my job. The honest truth is there's not jobs out there. I can't go work in another restaurant. None of them are open. And so they were fortunately, they were very helpful, or at least very agreeable in that.
Yeah. Seattle's kind of an interesting town in that you have these two, maybe it's more than two, but it's Amazon and Microsoft. Is there another gargantuan thing I'm forgetting in town? I guess Boeing?
Yeah, I mean, Google and Facebook have large presences here. They're obviously not the headquarters here, but them and Starbucks is another very large employer.
Oh, of course, Starbucks.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm getting at is there are like stratas in Seattle with some of, not just a few, but a lot of the richest people in the country, and then some normal people, and then some people like anywhere like struggling. And I wonder if there's been any kind of class divide or tension.
I think the one you're seeing the most, and it's not just a Seattle thing, but we definitely have a lot of it here, is in general a disparity between the sort of white white specifically in terms of race, but also white collar working class and people whose jobs are dependent in some way on physical presence and proximity to
Yep.
people. The people who are, yeah, they're stuck at home. Maybe they're stuck at home with their kids, which is no fun. But their job is
Hey,
still
let's
what
not
it
knock the
is.
kids.
No, I love my
Okay.
son, but it's
But these
definitely
other people, no fun. They're not having
no. I
any
just
fun
mean,
staying home with the kids.
well, it's more just like it's an added
It's a
challenge,
lot.
right? Yeah. And so I think that's been the biggest thing is the people who are going from a job where they're working in a certain kind of space and capacity, and that's shifted home to the person whose job just disappeared. There's been an ongoing conversation in Seattle for a while now about what does it mean that some of the largest companies, some of the wealthiest people live in this general area, and no one is quite sure how to grapple with that. But I think right now the tension that I'm seeing is less anger towards Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or whatever, sort of feelings about them, and more about the sort of strata of people in the city who are not seeing any real economic impact from this, maybe a lifestyle impact, but not an economic one, and the rest of the people who are. And that is, that's challenging to deal
Yeah,
with.
I was thinking less anger toward, not even anger, but just tension with Bezos or Gates, but more like all those people in town making like 250 grand a year who
Yeah.
they can survive a few months.
Yeah, and I mean I think that's a thing for sure, and it's a thing that I see again a lot. A lot of where I see it from are the people who I've worked with in the past, and up until recently in restaurants who are served a lot of those people. And in some cases, some of them were regulars, and I'll say, like, I won't go into the specifics, but I've heard I've heard stories of people whose regular guests found ways to send them essentially bonuses.
Oh, really?
Here's what I can do. Yeah, but there's a lot of people in restaurants who don't have that opportunity. They're cooks, they're
Yeah.
dishwashers, they're bussers, and those are the people who are I think also really put in peril by this because they don't have the means normally, and they don't have the connection to the wealthy people who they might be able to kind of like have as a benefactor in some fashion.
Kind of could have asked this as like a first question, but here I am asking it toward the end. Can you describe the mood? Can you get a sense of the mood when you're just sitting in your house?
I think that's actually a really fascinating question and a hard one to answer. I would say the thing that is most interesting to me is the way that when I do go to the grocery store on occasion, or walk my dog, or take my son out, it's the way that all of us, I think, are sort of like, there's just a kind of like, there's that like shrug emoji feeling,
Yeah.
and also the kind of like, can we still talk to one another? And it's like, you realize, like, you can stand 10 feet away from someone and have a conversation. It's not maybe the most, you're not gonna have a long conversation for the most part in that setting, and maybe it's a little bit odd to do that in public. But I've talked to a few of our neighbors on walks, and we keep a safe distance, but it's like, okay, I don't have to remain entirely disconnected from everyone around me. I mean, I guess I'm not a doctor, obviously, so that could be bad information.
No, but I
but I think
think,
there's,
no, and I kind of want to linger on this point just for a minute because I think they've given a specific number, right? They've said 6 feet.
yeah,
In fact, I work with CBS. We, in one piece, even encouraged people to do social things where they're very far apart but can still be in the same
Yeah.
physical space. That was happening out front of my apartment yesterday when the upstairs neighbor's son was having his birthday.
oh wow,
And kids from his class came by and they were on the sidewalk and he was on the front step, I don't know, 10, 15 feet apart. And a lady in a neighboring building opened the window and yelled, "You shouldn't be doing that. This isn't a time for a party. You need to be farther apart. You shouldn't be down there." And it's like, it was really something.
yeah. Well, New York City neighbors do tend to get up in everyone's business.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have
And
that
it's
experience for
denser
sure.
in general than it is there. But still, like, how we navigate this, and
Yeah.
like, in some moments it feels communal and we're all in this together. And in other moments, it almost feels like you're not supposed to even be in community.
Yeah. But there is something about that, being able to be in the same physical space as someone and have a conversation with them, and obviously further apart than I normally would be, where you get more of the experience of that being, in a person's presence. And obviously it's not something that can be done all the time or at great length, I don't think. But it's important, because as much as I love my family, just talking to them would be insufficient.
Because things have gotten better there for a bit, I wonder if there is any talk of second wave. Is that in the conversation there or not?
I think it's come up. I mean, again, I think this is a lot of the reason why I think wisely Governor Inslee and others in the state government got ahead of things, because I think if they had not sort of said we're extending this through the end of April, through I think March 4th or May 4th, I'm sorry, is the day. I think there would be, in a week or so, if you continue to see sort of decreasing numbers of new cases, and frankly, like, the weather got better, you would hear more and more sort of groundswell, like, hey, maybe it's time to start again. I have been surprised so far, and obviously it's a qualified answer, at how dramatically adhered to the rules seem to have been around here. I think that's been one thing that surprised me, is I thought I would see and hear more, whatever, it's not that big a deal. And that was the attitude everywhere, including here, for a while. But it seems like people have just really bought in, and obviously that's not 100%.
Wait, can you, because you're saying there was a change, can you at all identify when that change happened? You're saying it was that way at the beginning, then it wasn't.
The big tech companies in particular sort of issued work from home orders in late February, and I think that was a big wake up call to people. And then I don't have the date in front of me, I would have to look it up, but then I think in early-ish March, the public schools started closing down. Yep. And again, those two things were real signals to people, like, this is a big deal. And I think even more than the stay-at-home order, which obviously had a big impact as well, it was that really drove home to me personally, and to a lot of people I know, like, oh, this isn't just, if you're 65 and up, you should be careful. It's like, this is a big deal for everyone. And if Amazon and all that are doing that.
I heard the same thing from South Korea, where they said the closing of the schools in a country that takes education so seriously was what shook people awake. And you could see how people like Amazon and Microsoft, that are kind of authority figures in that community beyond the government, would have that same effect.
Well, and with those two, it was actually interesting. There's a piece that I read a few weeks ago about kind of how all of those companies, all the big tech companies that have large operations here in Seattle, all kind of had this ongoing conversation and announced the work from home orders sort of all at the same time. And in the same way that I think for maybe the country as a whole, the like cancellation of a lot of different sporting leagues kind of at about the same time was another big, like, oh wait, this is a really big deal to the country as a whole. Prior to that, in Seattle, when you've got sort of functionally competitors like Amazon and Google and Facebook issuing this sort of joint statement, like, we are instructing basically almost our entire workforce to work from home, like, that's a big, that resonated a lot here.
Okay, before we go, do you want to plug what your shirt's about? Disgorged.
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course. So Disgorged is my my wine business, essentially. And what I'm doing right now, because a lot of the functions of my business are not possible, is I'm doing twice weekly online wine classes. Wine education was really what I was doing in large part before all this. And if you search for Disgorged, you can find my website. I'm on YouTube. It's twice weekly, so Wednesdays and Saturdays at 5:30 p.m. Pacific. And I do about a half-hour class with a different topic every time. And it gives me a little bit of structure to my week and to my drinking, which is nice.
Any excuse for a glass, I'll take it. Zach,
Exactly.
Good to see you. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brooke.
Despite their early start, Washington State may not be opening back up any sooner than a lot of other places. Governor Jay Inslee says they need to get testing capacity up and the number of new cases down. That hasn't happened to the level that he wants yet. But some of those same Washington State-based companies that we talked about being kind of civic leaders in the closing down are now trying to start opening up. In some cases, Boeing has 27,000 workers returning to the job this week, and Starbucks has said they're going to try to start looking at whether they can reopen some locations. Next week, a really interesting conversation from Taiwan, one of the early coronavirus success stories. Until then, thanks for checking us out. Rate, review, I always forget, rate, review, subscribe. and stay safe this week. Hope to see you next Monday.